Hello, everyone. Welcome into a full edition here of Ville on the Ville. Wanted to talk about, as I expand on what I mentioned in my quick take video that I sent out not that long ago, wanted to talk a little bit more, very limited with those quick takes to just 2 minutes and change. And there's a lot to talk about. Obviously, the hope was I'd be talking about Louisville's placement in the NCAA tournament and their potential pathway to maybe a good little run. But as we all know, they did not get selected in the field this year, and I don't think any of us are all that surprised given the shortfalls that they had, especially late, 0.9 seconds, several other games that they were so close to winning and fell just short. So I don't think the shock was there for any of us. However, I think the surprise was the fact that looking back, once the committee did not have them in the field and then went back over the teams that were just on the outside looking in, Louisville really wasn't in the discussion. I think that's quite surprising, considering when you looked at those bracket matrix, the one that collects all the different bracketologies from across the country and comes up with the average, Louisville was, throughout the weekend, just out, the last team out, or in some cases, the last team in the field for the tournament. So when the committee comes out and says, well, here's the last four that missed out and Louisville's nowhere to be seen, very interesting, I think, development there, very surprising. Most surprising, and as I touched on in the quick take video, Notre Dame was indicated as the team that lost out when Davidson captured the A-10 championship by knocking off St. Bonaventure, which was selected with an at-large bid, and Rhode Island, who received an at-large bid. And they said Notre Dame was going to be that team. To me, that's absurd. As I touched on in the quick take video, Notre Dame was set to be the first team ever, I truly believe, given a bid to the NCAA tournament based on potential. Because as a full-strength squad, Notre Dame really did not show anything that would earn them an at-large bid into the field. They did have a decent win early in the year by 1 point over Wichita State, so you give them credit for that, certainly. But outside of that, they had a win over Syracuse on the road, actually when they weren't even at full strength. Very low-scoring game by 2 points over the Orange, but it was, I think, the very early in the conference season. But really, when you look at their body of work, total wins, they did not have a resume that looked any different than Louisville's when they were full strength. In fact, they looked a lot like Louisville, except the fact that they had some bad losses. Louisville really, outside of maybe Syracuse, you might say, no bad losses on Louisville's resume. Notre Dame had several, and a couple of those when they were at full strength, albeit early in the year. When you drop a home game to Ball State, that's a wart on the resume. And they also lost a neutral site game to an Indiana team that Louisville beat. The wins they had at full strength included Pittsburgh twice, Virginia Tech in a miracle comeback that most of us probably saw in the ACC tournament, and then they lost to Virginia and they lost to Duke. So again, very similar to what Louisville put together in terms of a resume, but the NCAA committee felt they were worthy of an at-large bid with that resume that looked an awful lot like a Louisville team that really received no consideration whatsoever for an at-large bid. And I think that's very concerning, and I don't understand why the committee would feel it appropriate to hand that out. Now, had they beaten Notre Dame, had they beaten Virginia, had they not lost to Ball State and Indiana, maybe it's more justifiable. But the fact that they were willing to do that for Notre Dame, really surprising. And to be quite honest, looking back, I'm kind of glad Davidson beat Rhode Island, because if I would have seen Notre Dame in the field and listened to that committee give the reasons why, none of them legitimate, and the only reason being that they were given a pass on potential, I think I probably would have been more upset with that than I am now with Louisville being left out. So those are my opinions in terms of the Irish and their crazy bid that they almost got on potential alone into the NCAA. That's a problem that I think needs to be investigated. I think more questions need to be asked of the committee if that's something that they want to get into the habit of doing, because I don't necessarily agree with that whatsoever, and I think few probably do outside of the Notre Dame fans. In terms of Louisville, as I mentioned in the quick take and just briefly a while back, not surprised they were left out. They had chances time after time, continually came up short. You get a little frustrated when you think, if they just could have gotten a break. You see so many teams get breaks. Heck, Virginia got more breaks in the final 0.9 seconds than Louisville seemingly got all year. And all Louisville needed was one in that game, and they're probably in the big dance. Miami on the road, the circus shot that they hit to tie the game to force overtime. the jump ball tie-up that extended the game, the missed shot against Seton Hall, the missed shot against Clemson on the final possession in regulation. So just opportunities missed all season long. I tweeted out over the weekend, it just seemed like it was a season of just not meant to be when you couple all the things that happened during the season, the unfortunate bounces, the missed shots that could have won games, along with all the outside stuff that happened, losing Rick Pitino, hiring a staff right as the season kicks off and practice kicks off, not having a full staff until nearly the start of the actual games being played. They were up against it from the get-go, and I think as the season progressed, any little obstacle they faced was that much more difficult, and I think that showed on more than one occasion on the court. And I think in the end, I think those little obstacles became much bigger for this team, and they had a little bit more trouble handling them when adversity struck. And really, I mean, again, you can't blame them. Everything they've been through, when you look at Quentin Snyder and Anas Mahmoud, the seniors on this team, your heart aches for them. They didn't sign up for all this stuff. The stuff that they went through was brutal. And you just really wish that they could have gotten one of those breaks to go their way throughout the season, and they would be having one, or they would get one more opportunity to play in the big dance. I don't think any of us were delusional enough to think they could have made a miracle run, but you just never know until you see a draw and you see the matchups. Crazier things have happened. We saw this team time and time again. My favorite thing to talk about on the year was when this team brought the effort, when they brought that energy, they could play with anybody. They had Virginia beat. And Virginia has been dominant regardless of who they've played. So that showed the potential they had, and it's just sad that they didn't realize that just a couple more times, and they certainly would have been, I think, in the dance. And I think looking back, two games where really you didn't see unfortunate breaks, but that Syracuse-Florida State home stretch, Florida State-Syracuse, back-to-back games at home, when they dropped those, I think the red flag went up in my mind, and oddly enough, it occurred right after the calendar turned to February, back in early January. My thing was, I'm not going to judge this team until February 1st, and that came right as they lost to Virginia on the road, and it was at that point, ironically, I was set to think, hey, this team, they have the potential to be pretty good, and I think we're going to see a good, strong finish despite a challenging schedule late, and then they turn right around and inexplicably lose two games at home to teams you feel like they really should have won, and that kind of set the tone for the rest of the season, and that brutal schedule late, coupled with a horribly timed announcement by the NCAA Appeals Committee coming right after that loss to North Carolina, heading to Duke, certainly did not help either. And you can just add that into those things that just seemed to be up against. This team seemed to be up against all season long. So those are my thoughts. The Cardinals now look to the NIT. I'll talk more on that here shortly, and how that looks, and is it the right decision or not for the Cardinals. Got a little drink. This cold air, this dry air is getting me. So next up, I wanted to speak on the selection criteria. The teams that did get in ahead of Louisville. Interesting this year that several things changed. They came up with this new quadrant system that I tweeted out. Never has the incompetence of the NCAA been on greater display than them finally deciding, probably a decade after it should have been done, that they were going to look to other metrics outside of the RPI as a way to measure teams' performance, because the RPI, back in its day in the 80s when it was developed, in large part because of what Louisville was doing with their scheduling, it was good. It was a good tool 30 years ago. However, you get the more complex advanced metrics like Ken Palm and Sagarin and others that show a little bit better picture of a team. They finally decide they're going to do that, again, about 10 or 15 years later than it should have been. But simultaneously, in the final year they're going to use the RPI, they come up with an entirely new quadrant system, and the metric they use to judge that quadrant system is the RPI that they've already admitted is outdated, and they're going to get rid of it. To me, that is absolutely ridiculous. That would have been a great time to say, look, we're going to institute this quadrant system, and we're going to use all of the different metrics to get an average as we transition away from using the RPI as a key metric in our selection process. But no, they're going to stick with that RPI when they do the quadrant system, and you get crazy things like Buffalo being a top 25 win for some teams. I'm sorry, I'm sure Buffalo had a great season, but that's the flaw with the RPI, and I think some teams began to learn you can creatively schedule using the RPI play a lot of smaller conference teams you think have a good chance to have a good season in their conference. It's a pretty easy win for you, but in the end, they win their conference or come close to it. That bumps your RPI way up, and I think that's part of the reasoning why they're getting away from the RPI and why it was outdated. But the selection process this year, including that quadrant system, they also did away with the last 10 games or the last stretch of games, how a team was finishing. And to me, that's among the dumbest things I've ever seen, because the whole point of having an NCAA tournament, any tournament, is the teams that are playing their best are going to perform the best at that time. So to take a criteria that focuses in on how well a team is playing at the end of the season and kind of throw it out and say we're going to use the body of work is absolutely ridiculous. And I think you saw a lot of teams like Arizona State, like Oklahoma, get a huge boost in being included in the field from wins that they had well back a month or way earlier during the season. In particular, Arizona State to me is the poster child of this kind of whacked out criteria this year of doing away with how a team finishes and using the quadrant system. They defeated Xavier and they defeated Kansas. 2 good wins, both before the calendar turned to January in 2018. Since the calendar turned, Arizona State in a very weak Pac-12 was not good, sub 500. But their entire resume was bolstered by those 2 wins way back at the beginning of the season. And no consideration really seemed to be given to how they were playing late. They did not even win a game in the Pac tournament. USC, on the other hand, USC, on the other hand, failed to make the NCAA field, and they reached the final and played Arizona in the Pac-12 final. Finished second, I believe, in the Pac-12 standings. Arizona State, I think, was well back with that sub-500 record. So just a crazy decision, I think, from the NCAA on multiple levels in doing away with that how a team finishes. To me, like I said, isn't that the whole reason you have a tournament, is to allow the teams playing their best at the end to prove themselves in competing for a national championship? So hopefully this is like a one-year hiccup. They're obviously doing away with the RPI as a key criteria. And next year, hopefully this will be looked back on and judged and said, you know what, we need to start understanding that how a team finishes is vitally important to whether or not they should be included in the field, and we shouldn't be judging wins. Now, they can still get credit for wins back then, but if you're completely floundering at the end, I don't really understand why you would not take that into consideration and let those wins from way back at the beginning of the year. Because a Kansas and a Xavier, they probably weren't playing as good back at the beginning of the year as they are at the end. And that's the whole point. They are playing better than they were earlier. Arizona State is not. They are losing games late, many games late. Kansas and Xavier were not. But again, the committee just seemed to not understand that, and that the lack of that optic to me is quite amazing. So hopefully next year when things change, they'll kind of readjust how they're doing these criteria for the NCAA and the teams who get in. Because that finish to me is the biggest thing. I just think it's absurd that you would do away with that how a team finishes criteria. So anyway, in terms of how a team is finishing, obviously Louisville is going to be finishing in the NIT. I am totally on board with teams playing in the NIT. I respect the tournament. I respect the history. However, I think the circumstances Louisville is looking at in this situation, I'm not sure if it's the best decision. And I'm not just talking about the team, but the coaches as well, the fan base in general. Morale is down. Team just is not feeling that great about how everything has been going. They announced they were going to the NIT last week, which apparently since then, players have said they really didn't want to play in the NIT if they did not make the NCAA tournament. So I think that was a major mistake. I tweeted out earlier that I think that's the second mistake I think Vince Tyree has made over the past month or so. The first being that they went right in and ripped those banners down the instant that appeal decision came down, when they really had 45 days. You could have allowed the fans to get into the final few games at the Yum Center to see those banners one more time, maybe snap a picture before you pull those down. But they waited no time at all in going in there and taking the banners down. Did not like that decision. And I did not like the decision, apparently, to, regardless of what the players and even from what I'm hearing, the coaches thought regarding an NIT appearance, they're going to go ahead and say you're playing in the NIT Normally, I say that's fine. The administration should be the one making the decision, but this circumstance, this team has been through enough. At this point, if they just want to pull the plug on things and move on, and you got to think about the coaches. If this staff is not going to be here next year, they probably want to get on with the next chapter in their lives. So I just don't know how this setup is going to be for Louisville facing a Northern Kentucky team that obviously they were disappointed when they lost to Cleveland State in the Horizon League tournament. After winning the regular season, they probably felt like they were right in line to get back to the NCAA again. But they're still going to be pretty pumped up to come down here to Louisville to play in the Yum Center. Second time. They actually were the first opponent to play Louisville in the Yum Center in an exhibition back in 2010. Obviously, the game didn't count, but I'm sure they're excited to return. You've got Tyler Sharp coming down. You've got a former teammate in high school of Quentin Snyder. They're busing students down. I'm sure there'll be plenty of fans. I'm sure there'll be plenty of Kentucky fans showing up cheering for Northern. So I'm very concerned about how this entire situation is going to develop. How many fans will be out there, especially now that you hear the team maybe not on board with playing in the NIT. So how's the turnout going to be? Is it going to be a lopsided or is it going to be 50-50 in terms of turnout? I just think it's a bad setup is taking shape heading into the game tomorrow night at the Yum Center against Northern Kentucky. So, hopefully some of this information coming out about the team not wanting to play isn't quite accurate. But given that you've seen it from multiple sources, Eric Crawford, Jeff Greer have all indicated that was the case. That's concerning. So, you just hope that this doesn't, you can't imagine it getting any worse, but it's certainly, if they lose at home to Northern Kentucky, that pretty much puts a nice little pile right on top of this Sunday that I'm not going to use the word, you know what I'm talking about, that we've been dealing with for the past 2+ years in Cardinal basketball. But we shall see. Hopefully the fans will get out there and support them. And hopefully, again, like I said, that there's not quite accurate information regarding that. But given some pretty respectable names putting that out there, you probably think there is some truth to it. But hopefully, once they get on the court, once they get going again, they'll want to compete and they'll want to win the game and want to move forward in the NIT. But again, I just think looking back, not really sure if for this Louisville team and this this coaching staff, usually the NIT is an opportunity to look for the future, build the team for the next year. But again, in terms of players and coaches, who knows who's going to be around next year? There's really nothing that that you can build towards with so many uncertainties moving forward for Louisville basketball. So we will wait and see and hope for the best on Tuesday night against what's going to be a fired-up Northern Kentucky team without question. But a team who doesn't have to worry about placement is the women. They await their placement tonight in the women's selection special. And I can't imagine they're not going to get placement in the Lexington region. Spectacular regular season, ACC regular and tournament champions. I feel like they're going to get that 1 seed, obviously. And I just don't see another team that would deserve the Lexington region over the Louisville women. And you think UConn will get their own regional? I think they just host regardless, it seems like. And then you've got Mississippi State. I think that was the team many thought could take that Lexington region away from Louisville, but they lost. Granted, they've only got one loss, but they lost in their conference tournament to South Carolina. So hopefully that was enough to push them away from the Lexington region. And I think if you're a conference, in what was considered the toughest conference in women's college basketball, you won the regular season, followed it up by winning the conference tournament, and in both instances you beat Notre Dame. I think that establishes it, and I think they will get that. But we'll wait for sure. Monday night they will release that for the women, so we can sit back and watch that and hopefully enjoy a selection special this weekend as the women hopefully get that good placement in their field in their tournament. The baseball team, to wrap up, they continue a fantastic start to this season. They did suffer their first loss. However, that was after they had already won the first 2 games on Friday and Saturday. North Carolina, a strong finish on Sunday. They defeated the Cardinals with a flurry of runs in the last few innings. Thompson went 6 innings very strong, a career high in strikeouts, but I think they tried to push it a little too far. I don't know if because they had that midweek 2-game series with Texas Tech, tried to get a little more out of him, kind of hit a wall in the 7th inning, and UNC kind of just got the snowball going, got the ball rolling, and got in a lot of runs and ran away with it. But you win every series 2-1, you're going to have a great year. And obviously they started fantastic. Last undefeated team for the second consecutive year in college baseball. That's pretty good. I mean, Kelly Dickey himself said it's probably happened before, but not even he. And I jokingly said, well, what good are you, Kelly? Even he said, I really can't begin to know how to find that out. But nonetheless, that's a fantastic accomplishment. You don't really get anything for it other than to know for a fact that you are a solid college baseball program, especially considering everything Louisville lost. I don't care who you're playing. If you get through 14 games without losing in any stretch in any baseball season, that's a great run. And so to do that 2 straight years, to have such a strong start, certainly sets them up well. Now, if they can just perform decent in conference play, they're going to position themselves for a strong finish. And obviously, they started strong in the ACC by getting this win, a series win over North Carolina. Now, again, good midweek series against Texas Tech. You don't see 2-game series in the middle of the week very often, and this is a good Texas Tech team. So we'll see. I don't know. The weather is kind of getting hokey right now. I think some more snow might be coming through. So we'll see if they have to jump around with the times on those games. But keep an eye out for that. They're usually good about getting the information out if they adjust those times, and out on Twitter you'll see that. But I wanted to get this episode out because I had a lot more to talk about in terms of the selection, the disappointment that Louisville didn't make it. Obviously, I do understand. Nonetheless, we're all still frustrated, and you complain about who got in and who didn't and why they did. But I had a few issues with those criteria I mentioned. I want to get that out there. I want to thank everybody who tunes into these. I know right now it's not huge, but everybody who tunes in is well appreciated. And again, this is hopefully building towards something that I can't talk about right now. But if it ever does develop, you'll certainly know what I'm talking about down the road. This has been Ville on the Ville. Again, thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time.